Call your commander. Victoria Bennett said it quietly, almost calmly, as the cold metal cuffs closed around her wrists. Officer Grant Miller stared at her for a moment before letting out a short, dismissive laugh. You really think that's going to scare me? Victoria said nothing. Around them, the elegant Atlanta restaurant had gone strangely quiet. Forks stopped moving. Conversations faded into whispers. A waiter stood frozen beside a table, watching as one of the evening's guests was escorted away from her dinner. Only 30 minutes earlier, Victoria had been smiling. She had been sitting beneath the warm glow of a brass chandelier, listening to soft jazz drift through the room while rain traced thin lines down the tall windows. Her black dress was simple and professional, the kind of outfit she often wore after a long day at the courthouse. On the table sat a half-finished glass of sparkling water, a small plate of untouched dessert, and her phone. She had been looking forward to this dinner. For once, she wasn't thinking about evidence, court filings, or defendants waiting for a decision. She was simply Victoria. A 34-year-old woman who had spent years earning her place in a profession where every mistake could change someone's life. She was a prosecutor. But she hadn't mentioned that tonight. There had been no reason to. Then Officer Grant Miller walked into the restaurant. At first, Victoria barely noticed him. He was off duty, dressed in plain clothes, but the confidence in his posture was unmistakable. He spoke briefly with the restaurant manager before turning his attention toward the dining room. Then his eye stopped on Victoria. Something changed. He watched her for several seconds. Victoria noticed. She lowered her phone. Their eyes met. Grant walked toward her table. I need to ask you a few questions. Victoria calmly looked up. About what? There was an incident outside. I haven't been outside. Grant's expression hardened. I'm going to need you to stand up. Victoria frowned. Officer, I don't understand. He didn't answer. Instead, he asked for her identification. She handed it over. He looked at it briefly, then back at her. Is this supposed to mean something? Victoria's expression remained composed. It means exactly what it says. A few people nearby began watching. Someone whispered. Another person quietly lifted a phone. Victoria could feel the room changing around her. She knew that look. The look people gave when they had already decided what they believed before hearing the facts. Grant handed her identification back. You're coming with me. Victoria stared at him. For what? Interfering with an investigation. I haven't interfered with anything. Grant reached for his handcuffs. Victoria looked down at them, then slowly back at him. For the first time that evening, her expression changed. Not to fear. Not anger. Recognition. She understood exactly what was happening. And she also understood something Grant Miller didn't. This was not the beginning of his problem. It was the moment his problem finally had a witness. Call your commander, she repeated. Grant smiled. I don't need my commander. Victoria said nothing. She simply glanced at the clock. 8:17 p.m. Then she stood and walked beside him without another word. 30 minutes earlier, Victoria Bennett had been enjoying the kind of evening she rarely allowed herself to have. Outside the tall windows of the Atlanta restaurant, a steady spring rain softened the city lights, turning the streets into ribbons of gold and silver. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and polished, filled with quiet conversations, clinking glasses, and the gentle rhythm of jazz playing somewhere near the bar. Victoria sat alone at a corner table, her phone resting beside her plate as she reviewed one final message from her office. Another long day at the courthouse was finally over. She had spent the afternoon in court arguing a difficult case, listening to witnesses, reviewing evidence, and answering questions that demanded complete concentration. Yet now, for the first time all day, she had allowed herself to breathe. She looked down at the small velvet box beside her handbag and smiled. Inside was a simple silver watch she had bought for her fiancé, Daniel Brooks. Daniel had promised to meet her after his shift, but an emergency at the precinct had delayed him. She wasn't surprised. Being married to the job was practically part of his uniform. Victoria glanced at the time and shook her head with a faint smile. Typical Daniel, she murmured. She had no idea that before he arrived, someone else would walk into the restaurant and change the entire evening. The front door opened. A gust of cool air entered with a tall man wearing a dark jacket. Grant Miller stepped inside and spoke briefly with the manager. Victoria noticed him only because his voice carried across the room. "I'm looking for someone who may have witnessed an incident outside." The manager pointed toward the entrance and Grant began scanning the tables. His eyes moved from one guest to another. Then they stopped on Victoria. She was a black woman dining alone, dressed professionally, with a courthouse folder partly visible inside her handbag. Grant's expression changed almost imperceptibly. He walked toward her. "Excuse me, Victoria looked up. "Yes? Were you outside around 8 o'clock? "No, are you sure?" Victoria gave him a polite smile. "I've been sitting here since about 7:30. Grant looked at her table, then at the folder inside her bag. "What do you do?" Victoria paused. It was an unusual question. "Why do you need to know?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "Just answer the question." Victoria leaned back. "I'm a prosecutor." For a second, Grant seemed surprised. Then his expression hardened again. "A prosecutor?" "Yes." "Federal." "That's correct." Victoria expected that answer to end the conversation. Instead, Grant pulled out a small notebook. "Then you should understand how investigations work." Victoria looked at him carefully. "I understand them very well." Several nearby diners had begun listening. Grant asked whether she had seen anyone leave through the back entrance. She answered honestly. No. She had not. He asked again. She gave the same answer. Then he asked why she had been watching the door. Victoria frowned. "I wasn't." "You expect me to believe that?" "I'm not asking you to believe anything. I'm telling you what happened." Grant stared at her for several seconds. There was something uncomfortable in the silence that followed. Victoria could sense that this was no longer about an investigation. He had already made up his mind about her. She quietly reached for her phone. "If this concerns an official investigation, you can speak with my office." Grant immediately said, "Put the phone down." Victoria looked at him. "I'm not calling anyone. I'm checking the time." "Then keep your hands where I can see them." Her expression tightened, but she remained calm. She had dealt with difficult people before. She knew that arguing with someone determined to misunderstand her rarely made the situation better. So she lowered her hands onto the table. Grant looked around the restaurant, seemingly satisfied that everyone was watching. Then he said the words that changed the atmosphere completely. "You're coming with me." Victoria stared at him. "Officer, I haven't done anything. We'll discuss that outside." She looked toward the rain-covered windows, then back at Grant. Somewhere across town, Daniel Brooks was still working inside the precinct. He had no idea that the woman he planned to marry was about to be taken into his own department. And Grant Miller had absolutely no idea whose dinner he had just interrupted. "Then you should come with me." Grant Miller's words fell across the restaurant like a door slamming shut. Victoria Bennett looked at him for several seconds, trying to understand how a simple conversation had turned into an arrest. "On what charge?" she asked. Grant glanced at the folder inside her handbag. "Interfering with an investigation." Victoria slowly shook her head. "I haven't interfered with anything." "That's not what I asked." "Then what exactly are you accusing me of?" Grant's jaw tightened. He seemed irritated by every question she asked, as though her calmness itself were a challenge to his authority. "You were near the entrance. You were watching people. And now you're telling me you don't know anything. Victoria looked toward the restaurant manager. You saw me come in. You know I haven't left this table. The manager hesitated. Grant immediately stepped in. Sir, stay out of this. The manager lowered his eyes. Victoria noticed the silence spreading through the room. People were watching, but nobody wanted to become part of the situation. A woman at the next table quietly whispered, "She's a prosecutor." Her companion answered, "Then why is he arresting her?" Grant heard them. His expression hardened. Everyone needs to mind their own business. Victoria took a slow breath. She knew the moment had passed when explanations might have worked. She reached into her handbag and pulled out her identification. Officer Miller, look at this carefully. He took the card. His eyes moved across the name and title. Victoria Bennett. Prosecutor. Grant barely glanced at it before handing it back. A title doesn't put you above the law. I never said it did. Then stop acting like it. Victoria stared at him. I'm asking you to follow the law. That sentence seemed to push him over the edge. He stepped closer and said, "Stand up." Victoria remained seated for one more second. She looked around the restaurant and saw the faces watching her. Some were curious. Some were uncomfortable. One man had his phone pointed toward the table. Victoria knew this moment would be remembered. She also knew that whatever happened next needed to be documented. Slowly, she stood. Grant reached for the cuffs. Victoria looked directly into his eyes. Officer Miller, are you recording this interaction? He paused. That's none of your concern. It will be. Grant gave a cold smile. We'll see about that. The cuffs clicked into place. A hush fell over the restaurant. Victoria lowered her eyes to the small velvet box still sitting beside her handbag. Daniel's watch was inside. Their dinner had been supposed to be a celebration of their upcoming wedding. Instead, she was being escorted out in front of strangers who didn't know her, didn't know what she had done, and didn't know that the man she was supposed to marry was about to become the most important person in the room. Outside, rain continued to fall. Victoria stepped toward the door and quietly looked back at the clock. 8:17 p.m. She remembered the exact time. And this time, she smiled. By the time Victoria Bennett arrived at the precinct, the rain had become heavier, tapping against the windows of the patrol car as Atlanta disappeared behind a curtain of gray. She sat quietly in the back seat, her hands resting in front of her, while Officer Grant Miller drove without saying a word. Every few minutes, he glanced at her through the rearview mirror, apparently expecting anger, fear, or some desperate attempt to explain herself. Victoria gave him none of it. She simply watched the city pass by. When the car finally entered the precinct parking lot, Grant stepped out and opened the rear door. Let's go. Victoria followed him inside. The fluorescent lights above the hallway were harsh and cold, completely different from the warm restaurant they had left behind. Officers moved through the station, phones rang, printers hummed, and conversation stopped briefly whenever they noticed Victoria being escorted through the building. Grant seemed comfortable. Too comfortable. He walked past the front desk and spoke to a uniformed officer. Interference with an investigation. The officer looked at Victoria, then back at Grant. What investigation? Grant's expression tightened. I'll handle it. Victoria heard the exchange but said nothing. Grant led her toward an interview room. Before opening the door, he turned toward her. Maybe now you'll understand that your position doesn't give you special treatment. Victoria looked at him calmly. My position isn't the issue. Then what is? Your report. Grant frowned. What about it? You haven't written it yet. He stared at her. Victoria continued, so you still have time to make sure it's accurate. Grant gave a quiet laugh. You really think you're in a position to lecture me? No, Victoria replied. I'm giving you an opportunity. His smile disappeared. He opened the door and gestured for her to sit. Victoria entered and took the chair. A small camera was mounted in the corner of the room. She noticed it immediately. Grant sat across from her and placed a folder on the table. Let's start again. Why were you watching the entrance? I wasn't. Why were you asking questions? I wasn't. Why did you refuse to cooperate? Victoria looked at him. I didn't. Grant leaned back. That's 3 denials. Victoria remained composed. They're also 3 facts. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Grant reached for his pen. Fine. I'll write that you were argumentative and refused lawful instructions. Victoria's eyes moved toward the camera in the corner. Are you sure? Grant paused. About what? Victoria looked back at him. Nothing. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 8:42 p.m. Then she folded her hands and waited. Grant began writing, completely unaware that every word he put on that page was bringing him closer to a truth he wasn't prepared to face. Grant Miller placed the pen down and leaned back, convinced that the situation was finally under his control. Across the table, Victoria Bennett remained silent, her expression calm beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. The interview room felt smaller with every passing second. A camera watched from the corner, its tiny indicator light glowing steadily, but Grant seemed to have forgotten it was there. Let's make this simple, he said. You answer my questions, and this goes away. Victoria looked at him. What questions? Grant opened the folder. Why were you at the restaurant? Having dinner. With whom? That's irrelevant. Not to me. Victoria paused. I was having dinner. Grant tapped the folder impatiently. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Victoria's eyes moved toward the clock. 8:49 p.m. She remembered the time because she had learned long ago that small details mattered when powerful people tried to rewrite events. Grant pushed a blank statement across the table. Sign this. Victoria read the first few lines. The document claimed that she had refused several lawful instructions, attempted to interfere with an active investigation, and became confrontational when questioned. None of it was true. She slowly pushed the paper back. I can't sign this. Grant's face hardened. Why? Because it's inaccurate. It's my report. Then write the truth. For a moment, the room went completely silent. Grant stared at her as if he couldn't believe she had challenged him. You know, he said, people in your position usually understand when they've been given a chance. Victoria looked directly at him. A chance to do what? To cooperate. I've been cooperating. Not enough. He picked up the statement again. Sign it. Victoria shook her head. No. Grant leaned forward. You're forgetting something. What? You're the one sitting in this room. Victoria remained still. And you're the one writing the report. Grant smiled. Exactly. He seemed pleased with himself, as though that settled everything. But Victoria noticed something else. Through the narrow window in the door, another officer had stopped walking. He was watching the room. His name badge read Marcus Reed. Their eyes met for only a second. Marcus looked at the document in Grant's hand, then at Victoria. Something about his expression changed. He seemed uncertain. Grant noticed him and immediately stood. Keep moving, Reed. Marcus didn't answer. He glanced once more toward the camera mounted above Victoria's shoulder before continuing down the hallway. Grant closed the door again. Now, he said, returning to his chair, let's try this one more time. Victoria folded her hands on the table. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't angry. She was waiting. Because Grant still believed the only evidence that mattered was the report he was writing. He had no idea that someone else had already started looking at the evidence he couldn't control. By 9:05 p.m., the precinct had settled into its usual rhythm, but something had changed in the hallway outside the interview room. Detective Marcus Reed stood at a computer terminal, reviewing the incident entry Grant Miller had just submitted. At first, Marcus expected to see the usual details of a routine arrest. Instead, he found several statements that immediately caught his attention. The report claimed Victoria Bennett had refused to identify herself, resisted instructions, and attempted to interfere with an active investigation. Marcus stared at the screen for several seconds. He had been a police officer long enough to know that reports could be imperfect. But this one didn't simply seem imperfect. It didn't match what he had seen. He remembered Victoria standing calmly beside the table. He remembered her answering Grant's questions. He remembered her handing over her identification without hesitation. Marcus looked toward the interview room. Through the narrow window, he could see Victoria sitting quietly while Grant continued questioning her. Then Marcus noticed something else. The body camera record had already been uploaded into the system. He opened the file. The timestamp appeared on the screen. 8:17 p.m. He watched the beginning of the footage. Grant approached Victoria's table. Victoria answered his questions. She did not raise her voice. She did not attempt to leave. She did not interfere with anything. Marcus paused the recording and looked back at the written report. The difference was impossible to ignore. He continued watching. Then he heard Grant's voice from the interview room. "You should understand how serious this is." Marcus glanced toward the door. Victoria answered calmly, "I do." Marcus looked back at the screen. He had heard that tone before. It was the tone of someone who understood exactly what was happening but was choosing not to escalate it. He opened another database window and searched Victoria's name. The result appeared almost immediately. Victoria Bennett. Prosecutor. The department had previously worked with her office on several investigations. Marcus sat back. Something wasn't right. Why would Grant arrest a prosecutor without confirming her identity? Why had he ignored her identification? And why was Victoria so calm? Marcus looked at the screen again and noticed a notation attached to her name. His expression changed. It wasn't a criminal record. It was an administrative contact restriction. Do not contact Commander Brooks regarding this matter without authorization. Marcus stared at those words. Commander Brooks. He knew that name. Everyone at the precinct did. Daniel Brooks wasn't just another officer. He was the commander responsible for the precinct. Marcus slowly turned toward the interview room. Suddenly, the arrest looked very different. He didn't know what connection existed between Victoria Bennett and Commander Brooks. But he knew one thing. Grant Miller had just walked into a situation far bigger than he understood. And behind the closed interview room door, Victoria remained completely silent, as if she already knew exactly what Marcus had just discovered. The door opened at 9:18 p.m., and Grant Miller looked up with an annoyed expression. He expected another patrol officer or perhaps a supervisor checking on the paperwork. Instead, Detective Marcus Reed stood in the doorway, his face unusually serious. "Officer Miller," Marcus said, "Commander Brooks is here." Grant's expression changed for only a second before he recovered. "For what?" "I don't know." Marcus stepped aside. A man in a dark navy uniform entered the room. Daniel Brooks did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room seemed to become quieter simply because he was there. He looked first at Grant, then at the paperwork on the table, and finally at Victoria. For a moment, his eyes rested on the cuffs around her wrists. Victoria said nothing. Daniel's expression remained controlled. "Who authorized this arrest?" Grant stood. "I did, sir." Daniel nodded slowly. "And the charge?" "Interfering with an investigation." "Which investigation?" Grant hesitated. An incident outside a restaurant. Daniel looked toward Marcus. Is there an incident report? Marcus answered carefully. Yes, sir. And body camera footage? Yes, sir. Daniel turned back toward Grant. Then we'll review both. Grant seemed uncomfortable. Commander, with respect, this woman was uncooperative. Daniel glanced at Victoria. Was she? Victoria remained silent. Daniel looked back at Grant. I'm asking you. Grant cleared his throat. She refused several instructions. Marcus quietly placed a tablet on the table. The footage doesn't appear to show that. Grant turned sharply. You reviewed it? Yes. Then you know what happened. Marcus held his gaze. Yes. Daniel took the tablet and watched the opening moments of the recording. Victoria sat quietly across the room, her face unreadable. Grant stood beside the table, suddenly much less confident than he had been 10 minutes earlier. When the recording ended, Daniel placed the tablet down. Officer Miller, did you personally review this footage before submitting your report? Grant paused. No, sir. Why not? I didn't think it was necessary. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. You didn't think evidence was necessary before submitting an official report? Grant said nothing. Victoria finally looked at Daniel. Their eyes met for a brief moment. There was no smile, no embrace, no sign that they knew each other. Not yet. Daniel turned back to Grant. Remove the cuffs. Grant hesitated. Sir, she's still under arrest. Daniel's voice remained calm. I heard you. Then he looked directly at him. And I'm asking you again. Remove the cuffs. Grant slowly reached for the keys. His hand stopped halfway. Commander, why are you personally involved in this? Daniel looked at him for a long second. Then he answered quietly, because you just arrested someone who happens to be very important to me. Grant swallowed. Who? Daniel glanced toward Victoria. She finally spoke. Daniel. The room fell silent. Grant looked between them. Daniel's expression did not change. Officer Miller, he said, meet my fiancé. The room went completely silent after Daniel's words. Grant Miller stared at Victoria as if he were seeing her for the first time. Your fiancé? He finally asked. Daniel gave a single nod. Yes. Grant looked toward Marcus, hoping for some indication that this was a misunderstanding. There was none. Marcus stood quietly beside the door, his expression serious. Daniel turned toward Victoria and spoke softly. Are you okay? Victoria nodded. I'm fine. Those two words seemed to make Grant even more uncomfortable. He looked down at the report on the table, then back at Daniel. Commander, I didn't know. Daniel's expression remained calm. That's the problem. Grant tried to explain himself. He said he had been responding to an incident, that Victoria had refused to cooperate, and that he had acted according to his understanding of the situation. But Marcus interrupted him. The footage doesn't support that. Grant stopped. Daniel picked up the tablet again and replayed the recording. The room watched in silence as Victoria answered every question calmly, showed her identification, and followed Grant's instructions. There was no confrontation. No attempt to interfere. No refusal to cooperate. Just a woman trying to understand why she was being treated like a suspect. Daniel stopped the recording. This is not about my fiancé, he said. It's about your report. Grant looked confused. So, you submitted an official report stating that she refused lawful instructions. The footage says otherwise. Grant looked at the floor. Daniel continued, you also failed to verify her identification before taking her into custody. Marcus placed another document on the table. There are 2 previous complaints involving Officer Miller that mention similar conduct. Grant immediately looked up. Those complaints were dismissed. Marcus replied, they were closed. That's different. The room became quiet again. Victoria watched without saying anything. She had no interest in using Daniel's position to erase what had happened to her. She wanted the same thing she demanded in court every day: evidence, procedure, and accountability. Daniel looked at Grant. You made a mistake tonight. Grant nodded quickly. Yes, sir. But the mistake wasn't arresting my fiancée without knowing who she was. Grant looked up. Daniel's voice remained steady. The mistake was believing you didn't need to know who she was. Grant had no answer. Daniel turned toward Marcus. Preserve the body camera footage. Preserve the restaurant security footage. Pull every document connected to this arrest. Marcus nodded. Yes, Commander. Victoria finally spoke. And don't change anything because of me. Daniel looked at her. I won't. She nodded. Then she turned toward Grant. You don't owe me special treatment. Grant lowered his eyes. Victoria continued, you owe every person you encounter the same dignity you should have given me tonight. For the first time, Grant had nothing to say. The badge that had made him feel untouchable only hours earlier could no longer protect the story he had written. The evidence had already begun telling a different one. The next morning, the restaurant looked almost exactly as it had the night before, but Victoria Bennett felt the difference the moment she walked through the doors. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, replacing the shadows and rain of the previous evening. The same tables stood in the same places, the same soft music played in the background, and the small corner table where everything had changed was waiting near the window. Victoria stopped for a moment and looked at it. Daniel Brooks stood beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. Ready? He asked. Victoria took one and smiled faintly. Now I am. They sat down at the same table. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then Daniel placed his phone on the table. The investigation is underway, he said. The footage from the restaurant has been preserved, along with the body camera recording and the original report. Victoria nodded. And Grant? Daniel paused. He has been removed from street duty pending the investigation. Victoria looked through the window at the busy Atlanta sidewalk. Good. She wasn't smiling because Grant had been punished. She was relieved because the evidence would now speak for itself. A few minutes later, the restaurant manager approached their table. It was the same man who had watched silently the night before. He looked nervous. Ms. Bennett, I wanted to apologize. Victoria looked up. For what? For not speaking up. He lowered his eyes. I knew what I saw, but I was afraid of making things worse. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you don't have to apologize for being afraid. The manager looked surprised. But next time, she continued, if you see someone being treated unfairly, remember that silence can become part of the story too. He nodded slowly. Across town, Grant Miller sat inside an administrative office while investigators reviewed the evidence connected to his actions. His report had been compared against the recordings. Previous complaints had been reopened for review. There was no dramatic confrontation, no revenge, and no shortcut around the process. There was simply accountability. That was what made the outcome different. Victoria had never wanted Daniel to use his position to make her untouchable. She wanted the system to work the way it was supposed to work for everyone. As they finished their coffee, Daniel reached across the table and gently touched her hand. I'm sorry your dinner ended that way. Victoria smiled. You know what, she said. The dinner isn't what I'll remember. Daniel looked at her. What will you remember? Victoria glanced toward the empty chair where Grant had stood the night before. That I stayed calm long enough for the truth to catch up with him. Outside, the city moved on. People hurried to work. Cars passed through the intersection. Another day had begun. But somewhere inside that precinct, one officer was learning a lesson he should have understood from the beginning. A badge can give someone authority, but it does not make that person above accountability. And Victoria knew something else. Justice was not about who had the strongest position in the room. It was about what happened when the truth finally entered it. She looked at Daniel and smiled. "Ready to finish our dinner?" He laughed softly. "Absolutely." And for the first time since the previous night, Victoria picked up her fork without looking at the door.
Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.